is an introduction. The session this evening is titled An Introduction to Special Education and Inclusion in the Toronto District School Board, and it's meant to give an overall, information to our families, parents, guardians, and caregivers who have children registered and attending schools in the Toronto District School Board. We have 3 presenters from the Special Education and Inclusion Department this evening that are presenting. I'd like to introduce Lorraine Bell. Lorraine can just wave. Thank you, Lorraine. And then we have Mona Moftakar. Thank you, Mona. And then we have Hiran Patel. Okay, and I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Effie Stathopoulos, and I'm one of the centrally assigned principals for special education and inclusion. And joining me this evening is my colleague, Wendy, and she's behind the scenes doing all of the technical pieces. Thank you, Wendy. Okay, so I just would like to remind everyone that this is a general information session for all of you. And as such, we won't be able to address any specific school-related questions or issues, but please know that the principals of the schools in which your children attend would be more than happy to support you if you are encountering certain issues or you have questions or concerns. We do direct you to them. Okay, so without further ado, since we are 5 minutes into our session, and I know that we have a lot of ground to cover, I'd like to pass it on to the presenters. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Effie, for that introduction. Thank you for going to slide 2. So welcome again to our session, everybody. Thanks for making the time to join us this evening. Basically, today our discussion is going to be sort of centered around how a tiered approach to inclusion supports all the different special ed processes that we have in the TDSB. And as we go through each process, we're going to share some sort of guiding questions to help support you as you begin or currently having these conversations with your school about your child's progress. If you do have some questions that come up through the presentation, please do put them in the chat. We will address them at the end. And next slide, please. So before we begin, I would like to do an acknowledgement of traditional lands. I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is situated upon traditional territories. These territories include the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Métis Nation. I would also like to recognize the enduring presence of Aboriginal peoples on this land. And I will now pass it on to Lorraine.
Thank you, Hiran. So our goals for the session this evening are to build capacity of all stakeholders to support the learning of all students in an inclusive learning environment. We're here to strengthen collaboration with parents, guardians, and caregivers to engage effectively in the decision-making process. And we're here to support parents, guardians, and caregivers to become and continue on as effective advocates for their children with special education needs. Thank you, Effie. We know that partnerships with our families and the communities are essential. We also recognize children as unique individuals who live and learn within families and communities. And we all reap benefits when we encourage ongoing dialogue with families about their children's learning and development. So this comment about families comes from our kindergarten curriculum. And it notes that families are composed of individuals who are competent and capable, curious, and rich in experience. Families love their children and want the best for them. Families are experts on their children. You are the first and most powerful influence on children's learning, development, and well-being. The next slide. So as parents and educators, our priority is to look after the whole child. By working together in partnership, we can set high expectations to maximize student success. And while most students are able to learn within the expectations of the regular curriculum, There are some students who may require different approaches to achieve success. They may need help to do the work at their own grade level, or they may need to be given work that is below or above their grade level. The key, though, is that all children can learn when given the tools for success. So the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how the special education process begins. And one way is teacher initiated. So when a teacher realizes that a student's having challenges, they gather additional information to develop a complete picture of that student. And this info gathering is an ongoing process. It begins at the earliest possible time. And because your involvement is key in this info gathering process, teachers will contact you, the parent, guardian, caregiver, perhaps the student, depending on their age, to communicate the findings and to co-plan next steps. Another way that the special education process begins is when it's initiated by you, the parent, guardian, or caregiver, or the student if over a certain age. When the parent feels that the child is having challenges, then you're invited to share your concerns and any additional relevant information with the teacher or the principal. And this ongoing communication between home and school helps us to have, again, a complete picture of the child. This graphic explains the process that a teacher can engage in if there are concerns about a student's academic learning or socio-emotional well-being. You'll note with the directionality of the arrows here that this referral process is not linear. It's open-ended, and the steps can and should be revisited or repeated as needed. Besides you, the classroom teachers are usually the first to recognize that a student is experiencing difficulty in learning. And that's why this ongoing communication with you can elicit valuable information that teachers can then incorporate into their planning. Teachers also benefit from discussing concerns with previous teachers, with other subject teachers who work with your child, also from reviewing information in the student's Ontario Student Record, their OSR, and perhaps making some initial program adjustments. These steps can then be recorded in an individual learning plan or ILP. Throughout this intervention process, we cannot stress enough the importance of the ongoing communication about student progress, as well as the plans for program adjustments. These should be shared openly, and this helps the teacher to assess the student's strengths and areas for growth in a progressive way. If the student continues to have difficulty, then a referral can be made to the in-school team, the IST. There, a discussion would take place that is anchored in the ILP, and we would share strengths and next steps. When the teachers feel they've exhausted the recommendations from the IST, we may proceed to an SST. But all students would need to be referred at an IST in order for a referral to be made to the school-based school support team meeting. So now I'll ask Kieran to take it away with tiered approach to support inclusion.
Sure, thank you so much. So I'm just looking at a couple of questions here, so I'll get to those in a minute, if you can be patient. As for some of the images are blurry. They are available on the TDSB website, which I can share afterwards with you. So I understand they are a little bit blurry, but these are all sort of images that are taken from the special education website. So as you can not so clearly see, basically what we do here is it's a tiered approach that we use in the TDSB. So I know it's difficult to see, so I will do my best to sort of at least, show you the different levels. So basically, what you're looking at, the green level, is considered tier 1. So these are kind of like strategies and interventions that you would use for all students. And having said that, we know that like all students are capable of learning and all students are intelligent. So this is what we try to do in the board, to sort of have this tiered approach to ensure that every strategy that is available is being implemented to help out your child. So as I was saying, tier 1 is basically for all students. Tier 2 would be getting into more individualized or more like smaller group settings in terms of for some students. And as you can see at the very top of the pyramid or triangle is what's considered tier 3, which are kind of like just for a few students. So that could be for students that are that could be in our intensive support programs, or these are students that could also be being currently considered for what's called a psychoeducational assessment. And something to remember is that there's obviously plenty of strategies. And again, I apologize for it being a little small, that you really need to, the school and the teachers really need to sort of go through the tier 1 and tier 2 strategies before sort of coming to the school support team meeting. And I will, while we're doing this, and if I don't have a chance to, I will find a link that I can share with you so you can take a look at this in more detail. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So one of the processes that is sort of started in terms of special education is it's called what the school or the teacher, they have to develop what's called an individual learning plan. Because as you know, if we know that there's some current concerns, it's always good to have a roadmap or therefore a plan in action to sort of decide, okay, what are we sort of going to do in this case? So I don't know, Alex, if you can open up the drive, so maybe we can get a closer look at the images here. Right there at the bottom are the HTTPS. I don't know if that should work to open up a new page. Perfect. And maybe we can zoom in just a little bit. That'd be great. And then I can sort of go through it. Oh, you're awesome. Thank you so much. So there are different sections to the ILP, and basically these are forms that sort of would need to be filled out. So the top piece is basically all the background student information in terms of the name of the teacher, the grade, languages spoken, and things of that nature. As you sort of go through, you can see that this process also is to sort of help us figure out and do some early identification of students who might be at risk. And then this is a good sort of way to document items and strategies that have currently been put in place in terms of trying to support your student. So what happens is that at these sort of meetings that we have that are called in-school team meetings and school support team meetings, which we'll get into more in a few minutes, basically this is where we're sort of examining what the teacher is doing programming wise to make sure that whatever those needs are that are listed, that they're actually being carried out, and what kind of interventions have been put in place, or which kind of interventions are going to be recommended. And then all of this in terms of the nature of the right intervention, the intensity and the duration, all that is sort of recorded on the ILP. So if Alex, if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see where for your information, in terms of section B, this is sort of what we gather in terms of the data, right? What are some of the baseline data that have been collected? And what are some of the simple findings that are sort of being used to address what our next steps are going to be? Section C basically is just categorizing what the concerns are or what the area of focus is in terms of what the IST or what the SST is looking to do. And as you scroll down, and I just want to let you guys know that this obviously is provided to families so that you sort of have a documented record of sort of what's been discussed and what's been done in terms of supporting your child. So if you scroll down, then we get into more of pedagogical strategies. That's just a fancy word for saying what kind of teaching strategies have been implemented to help support your child. And if you scroll down just a little bit more to the second page. Yep, so now we're getting into what every student has. They all have a huge list of strengths that we can use. And I know this is probably not clear, but I'll explain the bottom part here. Basically, this is talking about universal design for learning, which is basically what are some tools that the teacher has implemented and how are they being used to sort of impact your child in terms of supporting their learning. And universal means that what could be used for one child could be used for all in terms of a general strategy that might be effective for all children. So this is where sort of that would be recorded. And if we scroll down just a little bit more, we get into a section called DI, and DI basically just stands for differentiated instruction. So this is key because this will tell you what the teacher has been doing that is specific for your child, or i.e. differentiated, that the teacher is trying to help address the needs to help support building those gaps that have been identified previously. And as with all meetings, if you scroll down just a little bit, as the parents and guardians and caregivers, you will see, keep scrolling down, and you're going to see sort of where all this is documented at the end. Keep scrolling, and we're almost there. Perfect. So this is important for you to know. This part here is basically just telling you sort of who attended the meeting and what their role is, because I think that's important for you to know all the different people that are sort of involved in helping your child to succeed. And as you go down, as of course with any kind of plan, you want to have a plan of action. So as you can see, it sort of broken down into like what has been the recommendation, who's going to be doing it, what's that timeline for implementation, and maybe something's already been completed, and obviously the outcome of this action. So this is a document that sort of needs to be completed whenever a child is brought to a meeting, and it just really helps to support and document everything that's been done in place and what is going to happen in terms of helping out your child. Thank you, Alex. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so basically, I think I may have repeated some of this, but I'll do it again anyways, because it's always good. These ILPs are basically developed and they're reviewed during these in-school meetings, which is the I in IST, and the S is the school support team meetings, which there's a few more professionals sitting at the table. Basically, what this is, and I alluded to this earlier, is to sort of continue to help build capacity with teachers and to give them the strategies and ideas they need from different professionals to help meet whatever those student-specific needs are. And the other part that I did want to add is right here at the bottom is the other reason that we have really focused on doing the individual learning plan is that we want to sort of stop this historical pathway. So what would used to happen is you would have students sort of being presented at team, and they would go to the school support team meeting, and then they they through a process would be put into an intensive support program through an IPRC. And these acronyms for IPRC that will be sort of discussed in a few minutes. But basically here is to put the focus back on who's doing the teaching and how is that adult, or adults in some cases, going to help meet the needs of those students. And I will now pass it on to Mona.
Thank you, Hiran. So as parents and caregivers, your voice and input matters throughout the special education process, beginning with the ILP development, which as Hiran already mentioned, is the individual learning plan for your child. Once you get a copy of your child's ILP, here are some things you can look for. First, examine the ILP to determine that your child is presented as in a holistic manner. As Hiran mentioned, the ILP provides information about your child's learning profile. So once you receive it, you're encouraged to look at it and review it in order to obtain specific information about your child's strengths and areas of growth, their specific learning needs and/or social emotional needs, as well as their current level of functioning, specifically in the areas of math, reading, and writing. While reviewing the ILP, look to see that your child is presented in a holistic manner. Do you feel that the full scope of your child's abilities have been captured? Has the identity, lived experiences, preferences, and interests of your child been considered? As we will discuss in greater detail in the next slide, during an SST or an IST, there's a discussion about the supports and strategies that are being used in the classroom to support your child's learning. So it's important to ensure that we capture a complete picture of your child's strengths and needs, as this will help guide the teacher's programming. Ongoing communication with your child's teacher is important to ensure that you have an opportunity to share information about your child's skills and abilities that they demonstrate at home, so that this information can be incorporated into the ILP. Another thing you will note in the ILP is that it uses a strength-based approach to describe your child's learning profile. At the TDSB, we view all children as competent and capable of success. When we recognize children as competent and capable, we're more likely to deliver programs that build on their strengths. A good classroom program builds on students' identities, their lived experiences, interests, as well as their areas of strengths. The strategies recommended in the ILP should build on your child's strengths to develop a plan of action to support their needs. So for example, if your child struggles with writing, but they have very good oral speaking skills or are tech savvy, a good plan of action for your child would be to provide them with choices and options for demonstrating their knowledge in ways that don't strictly involve pencil and paper tasks. As your child's primary advocate, you can ask certain questions. Oh, if we can go back to the previous slide, please. Thank you. As your child's primary advocate, you can ask certain questions to gather more information about how your child is being supported at school. Here's a list of questions you can ask to help guide your conversations at the school around your child's ILP. Does the plan of action and recommendations made in the ILP draw upon some of my child's individual strengths? As mentioned in the previous slide, a good plan of action in the ILP will provide students with different ways to participate in their learning and to demonstrate that learning in a way that builds upon their unique needs and areas of strengths. As another example, if your child is a visual learner, then they will benefit from having visual supports in the classroom to enhance their learning. Another question you can ask is, how long will the strategies recommended in the ILP be implemented for in order to determine their effectiveness in supporting my child's areas of needs as well as strengths? When a student is brought forward to an IST or an SST meeting, the school team will recommend strategies for supporting the student in the classroom. As good practice, the strategies recommended in the ILP should be implemented for a period of 6 to 8 weeks prior to accessing higher levels of support for your child. And lastly, you can ask your child's teacher how your child is progressing and what their current levels are, specifically in the areas of math, reading, and writing. Educators are expected to assess their students, and the information that they gather through their classroom assessments helps them to identify their students' learning needs, which in turn informs their next steps in instruction and allows them to make programming decisions. For students being flagged at an IST or SST meeting, the information is recorded in an ILP. And Hiran is going to now walk us through the IST and SST process.
Thank you, Mona. So before we even go to an IST, I think one of the things is to talk about that, the teachers obviously have already communicated their concerns. So is this the right slide? That's what I'm just trying to check. Yeah, okay, I can do this slide, it's okay. So doesn't look like, it doesn't matter, we'll talk about this. Can you go to the next slide for a second? I just wanted to see what was on there. Thank you. I think this is the slide. So anyways, before we sort of do an IST, the teachers could be, communicating their concerns prior to the IST, right? And obviously you guys are having an important role in this to see like, okay, here's the issue. So at least you're aware of what the issues are in terms of whatever the perceived needs are, or whatever the kinds of interventions, instruction that have sort of been used. One way to look at the sort of IST process or the meeting is kind of like, as I used in my air quotes, meeting of the minds, where basically strategies are provided for the teacher through a consult with their school colleagues. And those are usually an administrator and the special ed resource teacher. Your attendance is encouraged, but we understand that life is obviously very busy, but it's not mandatory. But you will rest assured that if you are not able to make the in-school team meeting, that you would get a copy of that individual learning plan that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So what happens is that if the IST has sort of done everything, as Mona was saying, and it's been 6 to 8 weeks and strategies have been implemented, and there might still be some further questions, or there might be some concerns that are still being raised, then the idea would be to come to what's called the school support team meeting. And if we go to the next slide, I'll sort of give you an overview on what that is all about. So the SST, which basically stands for school support team meeting, basically what it is that they review and they discuss the strategies that the teachers have been already using to address the needs, right? So the idea here is to work as a big collaborative group to figure out what's an action plan and what are some strategies that we could try using that may not have been sort of considered. And there's different voices at this table. So you can have psychologists, you can have social workers, you could have attendance counselors, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, physiotherapists, and obviously the parents and guardians, and of course students if they're over the years of, if they're 16 years and older. So this is really good because it's also considered tier 3. We have all these different professionals that are meeting at the table. And just so you know, these meetings do take place at every single school in the TDSB, and they take place once a month. And this would be considered a tier 3 level of support because now we're really, really drilling down. We've looked at the ILP, we've heard from the teachers. Now we're going to hear from the team to say, hey, you guys tried this, let's try this, because the goal here is to keep working at making sure that we have that pathway that's, the pathway to success, as I like to call it. I think the only other thing I was going to mention is, and we'll talk more about this last point that you see in front of you, that if you can't attend, then obviously, like I said, you'll be given a copy of the plan and what the next steps will be. And sometimes what the school support team will do is they'll do what's called a recommendation to the IPRC, which basically stands for Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, which Mona is going to sort of help shed some more light on. So take it away, Mona.
Sorry, the next slide is the guiding questions. That's right. Thank you, Alex. So as parents and caregivers, your voices and perspectives are vital throughout the IST and SST process. So you're encouraged to contribute to discussions about your child, as parent voice is always welcome and your input is always valued. As parents and caregivers, you offer invaluable insight on your children's development, their lived experiences, strengths, needs, and interests. At the TDSB, we strive to create a culture of shared responsibility with our families so that we can collectively support the learning of all students. As you navigate through the IST and SST process, here are some things that you can consider. Your child will be presented as a competent and capable learner, and their brilliance recognized and presented. As I mentioned earlier, at the TDSB, we recognize that all our students are competent and capable of success. Your children are holistic individuals with a multitude of strengths. It is important that when your child is being presented at a team discussion, their brilliance is recognized and presented. If there is a belief that there is an underestimation of your child's academic capabilities, this should be addressed in your discussions at an IST or an SST meeting. If a bias about your child is suspected, you're encouraged to address it with the school team. It is well known that everyone has unconscious bias. These implicit biases are linked to the inequitable outcomes we are seeing in our board, as our Black and Indigenous students are overrepresented in special education programs and IEPs. If a bias is suspected about your child, then it's important that this be interrupted and addressed. When possible, attend school meetings involving your child. Your active involvement and participation is vital to your child's success. If you cannot attend an IST or SST meeting, you can request a copy of the ILP so that you will be kept informed about the plan of action for your child. Here's a list of guiding questions that you can ask as you navigate the IST-SST process. Was my child given an opportunity to access and demonstrate their learning in a way that best suits their areas of strength? What classroom strategies are being used to support my child's needs? Is the IEP needed for my child to access the curriculum expectations? What accommodations can be supported in the classroom that does not require an IEP? How is the identity, lived experiences, strengths, and interests of my child being centered and leveraged in the classroom program? As mentioned before, in a diverse classroom, there's no single method that can reach all learners. Multiple pathways to achieving goals are needed, so it's important for educators to provide a range of teaching strategies, resources, learning activities, and assessment tools in order to meet the different strengths, needs, and learning styles of all their students in the classroom. Also, there are many accommodations that can be used in the classroom that do not require an IEP. The IST-SST decision to place the student on an IEP or access higher levels of support is really based on the learning conditions that is set up in the classroom by the teacher and based on the teacher's ongoing assessment and evaluation of the student. As mentioned earlier in our workshop, supports and interventions at the TDSB are tiered. If the student is not responding effectively to those classroom-based interventions or Tier 1 and Tier 2 tasks, then they may be considered for an IEP or referred to an SST. And I believe Lorraine will now walk us through IEP development.
Sure. Wondering if we can go back to 16 very quickly, please, Effie. Just to set the context for IEPs, Regulation 18198 requires the development of an IEP for every student who's identified exceptional by an Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, an IPRC. An IEP may also be developed, however, for students who have not been formally identified as exceptional and who require special education programs and/or services. Equity, anti-oppression, Anti-racism, anti-ableism, and inclusion discussions must occur before any IEP is created. Before that initiation or development, especially for non-exceptional students, staff are to consider the journey of students within IEP, whether that IEP has leveled the playing field for students' access to learning and achievement, what story the IEP tells in terms of student achievement. Is it closing achievement gaps? What language is used throughout the IEP? Does that language differ for Black, Indigenous, and racialized students? And how does the IEP journey show evidence of student growth? So these questions and prompts are to promote an intentionality around IEP development, although students are still able to access an IEP if one is needed. And Effie, if you don't mind moving forward to 21, then we'll talk a bit now about what an IEP is. Thank you so much. So an IEP is a written plan that describes the special education programs and services that are developed for a particular student. It identifies learning expectations that are modified from or are alternative to the expectations given in the curriculum policy document for that grade level, or in a secondary credit or non-credit course. The IEP also outlines any accommodations or special education services that are needed to assist the student in achieving learning expectations. It provides a framework for communication with parents, guardians, caregivers, the student. It provides information about their progress on both the progress report card, the alternative report card for students in developmental disability intensive support programs only, as well as the provincial report card. So the takeaways here are that the IEP is written in collaboration with the parent, guardian, caregiver. It's based on assessment. It drives instruction. It can and should be updated, and it is a fluid working document. So the IEP serves as an accountability tool for all parties involved in helping the student to meet their goals and learning expectations. Next slide, please. So now that we know what it is, an IEP is not something that will outline all lesson plans. It won't itemize every detail of your child's education. And the IEP is also not a means to monitor teacher effectiveness. TDSB's position is that students who are not exceptional can receive resource support for one reporting period without the development of an IEP. If the recommendation of the IST or the SST is for continued support beyond that, then an IEP may be developed. At the secondary level, a student must have an IEP to be enrolled in the GLE, the General Learning Strategies, and to be granted any GLE credit. And the next slide, please. So some decisions about modifications can impact a student's educational pathway. For example, modifications at the secondary level can affect credit attainment. So it is really important that parents, guardians, and caregivers understand the accommodations and or modifications that their child currently has. And maybe especially in grade 8, when we're looking at that transition to secondary, because we're aware that the accommodations and modifications therein can impact the student's future program pathway. So there's more information regarding pursuing an Ontario Secondary School Diploma, OSSD, or Ontario Secondary School Certificate, OSSC, and they are different and the outcomes are different. And so there's a link here to the Ontario Schools K-12 policy and program requirements, where more detailed information can be found. But the takeaway here is to just ensure that open conversation, especially for students who are pursuing intensive support program support beyond grade 8. Thank you. As part of the transformational work being done in special education and inclusion, we're continuing to take steps to address the overrepresentation of racialized students, particularly Indigenous and Black students in special education programs. To this end, administrators are being asked to, 1, continue to interrupt the automaticity with which IEPs are initiated for students before other pedagogical strategies are implemented. 2, to review IEPs for non-identified students. Are there any who can be removed from an IEP? Are there accommodations they can access that will level the learning playing field, so to speak? Because if so, maybe an IEP isn't needed. Maybe those accommodations can be made for all students as just good teaching practice, And maybe we can remove that IEP for a student who isn't likely to pursue an increase in special education support. We're also encouraging administrators to 3, ask for all students, including students in kindergarten and grade 1, why an IEP for this student at this time? So when we're reviewing whether an IEP is necessary for a student who's not exceptional, we consider the following questions. Has the IEP changed over time to reflect student identities and lived experiences? Is the assessment data current, culturally relevant, updated? What learning and/or tool is required to shift the minds regarding creating and developing effective and current IEPs? So we preface with this idea of being intentional and really asking some reflective questions before jumping to IEP development, figuring out whether the student's success can be access to success can be increased through tier 1, tier 2 strategies. And the reason is that we want to target implicit bias in our education system. We're striving to support inclusion and disrupt oppressive practices, and especially to combat the overrepresentation of racialized students in special education programs. But I will reiterate that any student who requires an IEP can always have one. And that may even be a student in kindergarten or grade 1. In consultation with the school team, those conversations are ongoing and continue. And so we don't want for you to leave thinking that they can't have one, but really it's important to have that conversation at the school level. So now we'll ask Karen to discuss your role in the development of the IEP.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. So as you can see, this is the parent consult piece of the individual education plan. And this is very, very important for schools to know, or your teachers to know, in terms of what is it about, your child's personality, how are they developing, how do they learn best? And there are different questions. And I know, again, if you can't really see the questions, but this is sort of sent home to families prior to an IEP being completed. And this is the whole pathway that we like to follow, is just having that open communication, and it's ongoing, and there's cooperation to figure out, okay, we obviously as parents, you guys know your child the best, and in terms of giving us that sort of lens in terms of what might work at the school level. And what we also try to do in this case is we also try to get and honoring student voices, getting students involved in this process. So maybe sitting down with your child and going through it, right? Because if we all think about it, sometimes, a child might say, well, I like doing things this way. And we're like, whoa, we didn't know that. Thanks for letting us know. So the part around that is just getting them involved in the process, because at the end of the day, we realize that, they're the ones going to be in the classroom. They're the ones that are going to be learning and doing the work. So it's always important to sort of get them involved in this conversation anytime we're talking about developing an IEP. And just so you know that this is, the principals of schools are it's a legal requirement to make sure that you are consulted in the development of the IEP. And I was just wanted to add that to even see like the contributions that you've obviously taken the time to create, to see them reflected on the IEP, right? Because without your input, we wouldn't really know, oh, we didn't know that your child prefers learning this way, or that you said this is something that might work at home. So, hey, why don't you try this at school kind of thing. So it's part of that ongoing conversation in terms of what goes on with that. So this is something that you would sort of expect to see at the beginning of any year, or when an IEP was first started. As Lorraine said, profiles can change in terms of like assessments can change. So every year a student, if they happen to be on an IEP, you will get a consultation that are like this in September at the beginning of the new school year. So if you can go to the next slide, I believe this might show a few more prompts in terms of answering. And just to add something here is that if it's not sort of applicable to your child, then there's no real need to fill out, right? So this is just a case of what is really important for you to have the school know and be aware of, because some of the categories may or may not be applicable to your child. So we wouldn't want to sort of cause any stress or anxiety saying, wait, this doesn't really apply. Why am I filling this out? So it's okay if sort of, for example, a few sections are not filled out because it just doesn't apply to your child. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, I like that C word, collaboration. So at this point, this is kind of summarizing what I've told you, is the idea that it gives us, a bit deeper look into your child in terms of what will work in terms of developing the IEP and what kind of things we can put on it. Well, obviously there's a justification and why we're developing an IEP. And I really like this point is the fact that you're kept informed, right? So the IEP, yes, it's a legal document, but it's a living document. And what I mean by saying that is that changes and updates can be made every term, and it can even be more frequent than that in terms of, for example, a certain strategy no longer is working, so the school is going to try something different, so to reflect that on the actual IEP. And again, it just encourages that sort of ongoing communication on a regular basis with your child's teacher. It says teacher, but teachers, in terms of some of the older kids might have Rotary teachers. And I would also like to point out the last point that's mentioned here on this slide is that if your child happens to be on a modified IEP, in terms of what kind of impact, as Lorraine was talking about just a few minutes ago, in terms of educational pathways, right? So does the child need to be modified? Modified just means that they're not working at the grade level that the child is in. And is there a need to have it modified? Or is there been evidence that the gaps have been closed, that we don't have to have a modified program anymore? So I think what I wanted to do is just sort of go over that piece for you in that sense, in terms of just that piece right there. It says it right there. I couldn't even say it better. Your voice matters, right? Without your voice, there's not really much, without your voice, you're the ones that sort of guide everything in terms of how we help your kids get better and everything. So like I said, get your child involved in terms of this process and just sitting down and filling this out. And if obviously you can review it afterwards. And like I said, it's a living document. So you can always come back later and say, hey, I don't think this really applies. Can we go and change it? Certainly, you're more than well within your rights to change anything that you see sort of on an IEP that doesn't fit your child's profile anymore. So on that note, I would like to now pass it once again to Mona.
Thank you, Hiran. Sorry, Effie, can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. So as Hiran mentioned for us, your voice really does matter throughout the IEP development, and you are really important members of our IEP team as parents and guardians. So here's some ways you can really bring in your voice in those conversations about the IEP development for your child. During the parent consultation phase of the IEP development, ensure that your insights and input about your child are given due consideration. Determine the justification for the development of the IEP. As Lorraine mentioned to us previously, anti-oppression, anti-racism, and inclusion discussions must occur before any IEP is developed. As well, as mentioned earlier, the IEP is a working document that must be reviewed and updated as necessary at least once in every reporting period. Make sure that you are kept informed about the updates and changes that are made to your child's IEP. And any programming changes that are made will be documented on page 5 of your child's IEP, as well as communicated to families. And lastly, as both Hiran and Lorraine mentioned, continue to communicate with your child's classroom teacher, the principal, and openly question the long-term impact of modified IEPs on your children's educational pathway. Modifications are changes made to the grade level expectations for a subject or course in order to support a student's learning. So, continue to have those conversations, because they can impact on your children's educational pathways. And it's important for that clear communication to be there between parents and caregivers and school staff about their impact. Next slide, please. Here's a list of questions that you can ask when an IEP is being considered for your child. What classroom interventions and strategies have been used to support my child in order to mitigate or lessen the need for an IEP? What evidence is there that my child is not producing classwork that is at grade level? How will my child's progress be assessed or measured in relation to the IEP? What is the impact of this IEP on my child's educational pathway? And how can I support the goals outlined in my child's IEP? In planning an IEP for students with special education needs, the teacher, with the support of the IST and SST, begins by considering the student's strengths and needs and their instructional level. A student's instructional level is determined by the teacher's educational assessments and takes into account other professional assessment data if such data is available for your child. In light of this assessment information, the teacher considers a starting point for the IEP and the curriculum expectations that are appropriate for the student's instructional level. Again, when the accommodations and classroom supports being utilized are not enough to support a student's specific learning needs, modifications may be considered for your child. These modifications reflect where students are currently in their learning, where they need to go, and how to get them there. Finally, assessment for students with special education needs is an ongoing and continuous process. The IEP provides a framework for communicating to parents and caregivers information about the student's progress on both the progress report card and the provincial report card. And I believe Hiran is next to walk us through the IPRC process.
Thank you so much. If we can go to the next slide. Again, this is this link actually this will be shared afterwards, so you can get a closer look in terms of it. I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but basically, this is just showcasing that. Let's just say that the IPRC, the Identification Placement Review Committee, that's the formal process that we do to determine if a student is exceptional in terms of if they have special needs for learning. And if they are so, then what would be the actual appropriate program setting, right? So these are two things that would be discussed. So that would be the I, which is identification, and P would be the placement piece in terms of placement could be, was it going to be in a regular class with some resource support, or is it going to be in a special education class for part of the day, or is it going to be for the full day? And the way the IPRC works is only students that are currently enrolled and attending a TDSB school, those would be only eligible for consideration by a TDSB IPRC. And obviously, to get to this stage, an IEP is required to sort of start and engage in this process of going to the IPRC meeting. So basically, the idea of the IPRC is to basically take a look at the student's learning strengths, right? So again, just like the IST and the SST, we encourage parents and caregivers and family members to, and obviously students over the age of 16, to sort of attend these meetings and take part in discussion. Again, if it's not feasible for whatever reason, then there is a copy of the decision statement that is provided that you can sort of look at as an overview in terms of what was discussed at the meeting. But just the final decision would be eventually yours in terms of the placement piece in terms of that. So the idea is also that once a student sort of has been deemed exceptional through the IPRC process, there can be what are called annual reviews. And these are usually, well, not usually, they're school-based and they can take place yearly. And the idea here is it's kind of like a check-in, as I talked about earlier, it's just in terms of a formal check-in to see, is the support still needed? How is the child doing? Kind of also like a formal update, right? To see what sort of happened since the last meeting that took place for that student. And again, if there's things that in the IPRC that you feel like, doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel fixed or resolved or whatever the word is, then you would just sort of connect with your school principal first and just have a chance, have a conversation. And if that sort of doesn't work, that there is a guide to special education for parents that I think there's a link in here that we can share. Once this is done, I believe we can put up the link in terms of where this slideshow will be made available. So then I understand we've been going through a lot of terminology information, but I think having a copy of this, then you can sort of, go through it on your own pace and time to sort of go through it. So yeah, again, I apologize. There's a lot of arrows and stuff, but I think once you get a chance to sort of sit and look at this afterwards, I think it'll really be helpful for you. So that's sort of in a very brief nutshell is what the IPRC process is about. And I think I'm going to pass it back on to Mona.
Thank you, Hiran. So again, your voice matters. And so for some of our families, the IPRC process will be new to you. So it's really important that you take the time to learn about it. And the school staff, as well as your special education inclusion consultants, are really there to help you with understanding this process. Here are some things to ask yourself as you navigate through the IPRC process. Have I felt supported throughout this process? Do I feel that my voice, identity, culture, concerns, and input have been acknowledged and validated? Do I feel that I fully understand all documentation, placement options, pathways that the IPRC may lead to? Throughout the IPRC process, principals, school staff, and special education inclusion consultants will work with families to ensure that they feel supported throughout the process. Principals are to acknowledge and validate their parents and caregivers' voice, identity, culture, and any parental concerns prior to attending the IPRC. As parents and caregivers, you should fully understand all of the documentation and the placement options and pathways that the IPRC may lead to. please do not have any sort of trepidation to ask for clarification about anything that is not entirely clear to you. And here's some guiding questions that you can ask during the IPRC process. Next slide, please. So how will an ISP placement impact on my child's educational pathway? How can my child's needs be supported in a regular classroom setting? If an ISP class placement is decided upon for my child, what efforts will be made to integrate and include my child in regular classroom programs and activities? How often will my child's exceptionality placement be reviewed? The Toronto District School Board is committed to the inclusion model. Therefore, at primary and secondary school levels, before considering placing a student in a self-contained special education classroom, the IPRC will first consider inclusion in the regular classroom with appropriate accommodations in place for the student. However, we do recognize that every student with special education needs is unique. Therefore, the TDSB will continue to provide intensive support programs for students with more complex learning needs. At the IPRC, the student's cognitive profile and their particular strengths and areas of growth will be discussed. In view of all of this information and with parent input, the IPRC will consider the most appropriate placement for your child, which could mean a regular class or special education class. Ultimately, you are in the driver's seat, so the type of placement that your child receives will really be decided on an individual basis, depending on both your preference and your child's unique learning profile. It is important to mention that in most cases, special education placements, so placement in our ISP programs, are expected to be transitional and of limited duration. Successful reintegration back into the regular classroom is always the goal. And the next slide, please. So the kindergarten program is based on the belief that all children, families, and educators are competent and capable. At the TDSB, this belief is extended and applied across all our grades, starting from kindergarten to grade 12. When we adopt this asset-based view of children, families, and educators, this leads to better educational outcomes for all students. When we view our families as valued partners, they are seen as valuable contributors to their child's learning and are engaged as partners in meaningful ways. When we view our students with an asset-based lens, deficit thinking is rejected, and we create a culture of high expectations for all of our students. This view leads to improved academic outcomes for all students and strengthens homeschool connections. And the next slide, please. So I believe is this Lorraine?
I think it's Effie.
Well, hello, everybody. So I'm just trying to figure out how to take my my camera, put my camera back on. Okay, so how you can help. So how you can help is, your child in school and all of the teachers and the folks in school that are supporting your child is to share any helpful information that you may have, including any strategies that are successful at home, any suggestions, ideas, any type of information related to medical history, developmental milestones, anything of that nature to support just the development of successful strategies at school. So when the school is able to illustrate a complete picture of any child, the academic strengths and needs, any type of vision or hearing, speech, we like to rule things out so that we are able to support students in school to the best of our ability. Following up on any school requests for further information. For instance, you may be asked to have your child's hearing aid or vision checked. And the reason why we ask those things is to rule out if there are any, needs associated with vision or any needs associated with hearing and so forth. So we can just try to get to what is the root cause of what seems to be getting in the way of your child being successful in school. So the next piece here is given written permission for the school to communicate with community resource people that are supporting your child. At the school support team meeting, when you're at that level, there are supports that are board supports, and so we bring in, and I'm sure it was noted earlier, as the school psychologist, social worker, a speech and language pathologist, occupational therapist, and so forth. These are board supports, central board supports, and for these support personnel to work with your child, there has to be written permission, if any of these supports are recommended, that the written permission will be discussed with you. And again, no information is ever shared without your permission with any of our central board staff. And just to keep in mind, though, that inclusion consultants, so for example, Mona and Hiran and Lorraine, and they are teachers in the TDSB. So they're inclusion consultants. They do work in the capacity of teachers, and they're there to support their colleagues, the other teachers, in supporting your child. So they would be looking at any assessments, any information to help with preparing the learning environment to ensure that your child is feeling represented and heard, and successful in the learning environment, any type of assessment, teaching strategies, and so forth. They work with the classroom teachers and any other staff in the building to support your child. And working together with the school, again, it's all about, Hiran said it best in terms of, ensure that you're sharing your voice. Working together with the school it's a critical piece. Sharing ideas, trying different methods. It's, supporting, communicating. It's all about collaboration. And certainly, if there's an instance where, a problem arises or there are concerns, please work with the school to address them. It's the only way that they'll be effectively addressed. It's key. It's key to ensure that your children know that you are working in partnership with the school, and it makes them feel safe and secure, knowing that when they're home, the school is being there's the messaging from school to home is that communication is open, and it's collegial in many ways, and it's really focused on the child. All of our discussions, all of the strategies are focused on your child's success, and children need to know this. Okay, and so that last little piece there at the bottom is parents, guardians, and caregivers are the key. You know your child best, so please engage in those conversations with the school administrator if there are any concerns. And the next slide here that I'm going to address is titled Steps to Address Questions and Concerns. And what this outlines here is what we call the Parent Concern Protocol. So at any time, if a parent, a guardian, or caregiver has a concern, any questions or concerns, the first place to go to is the classroom teacher. That's the first place you go to about any classroom-related questions or concerns, because these teachers are the teachers are the ones that are working directly with your child. If for any reason your concerns are not, or questions are not addressed at that stage, you then would visit the school principal. If you would like some more information, if you have more questions that perhaps maybe arose from your conversation with the teacher that are beyond the classroom, that's when you would go to speak with the school principal. If for any reason, after speaking with the school principal, you feel that your concerns are still not addressed, or you have questions that that still have not been answered, well, then the third step is to address these with a school superintendent. And superintendents are responsible for a network of schools. So the way the board is set up, we're set up in 4 quadrants. So we have Learning Center 1, 2, 3, and 4. And every learning center has 6 learning networks. And each one of those learning networks has a school superintendent. And our school superintendents are heavily involved in their schools. They're constantly visiting. They know the ins and outs of all the schools, and they're there to support our schools and our families. So and again, so they can be contacted if you have questions that have not yet been answered. And then the fourth step is the school executive superintendent. So executive superintendents are responsible for a learning center. How I just mentioned, there were 4 of the various networks of schools. So they support staff and can be contacted if you have questions, again, that have not been answered. And then, of course, the final step would be to contact your elected trustee. They are elected community officials, and they're available to assist you if you have any outstanding questions or concerns that remain. Okay. And our final thought. Okay.
So our final thought, thank you, Effie.
Yes, you're welcome.
So our final thought that we'd like to leave you with is, in many Indigenous communities, children are viewed as gifts. And in special education and inclusion, we really do recognize each child and the gifts they bring and their unique abilities and the skills and strengths that they bring into our spaces. And we strive to create learning environments that really honor our students' individual gifts and their lived experiences and identities, and seek to create environments and relationships that contribute to a child's sense of pride in who they are and the gifts that they possess.
Thank you, Mona. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Lorraine and thank Mona and thank Kieran for taking time this evening to present this informative presentation to all of our families in Learning Centers 1 and 4 who were able to join us this evening. I know that we've been working here behind the scenes to answer your questions. If for any reason you feel your questions have not been answered, as I noted just a minute ago, please connect with your child's home school. Connect with the administrators, connect with the teachers, and open up those lines of communication and work through any situation so that you and your child feel that they are you play an integral role in your child's education and their success. So we'd like to take this opportunity to again thank you for coming out this evening, and wish you all a wonderful night. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.